Welcome to the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, the podcast where we discuss religion, popular culture, and everything in between and beyond. I'm Lala Thomas, and I am joined, as always, by my lovely friend and colleague, Vivian Asimos. How are you, Vivian?
I'm beyond.
Are you beyond, like Star Trek?
Yes.
Like Star Trek Beyond, or one step beyond, like Madness, and to infinity and beyond, like Buzz Lightyear. Just getting all the pop culture references in.
Just got to get them all in. That's
Gotta
what we're
get
here
them all
for.
in. Are you feeling Christmassy, Vivian?
Yeah. I think as Christmassy as I get. I'm not normally
Yeah.
a big Christmassy person, which I think would be an interesting conversation in of itself, is what does it mean to feel Christmassy? But that
I'm
might
a
be
very Christmassy person, I have to say. I'm not one of those people who gets festive in November and puts decorations up then, but I'm also not one of those people who gets grumpy when I see people put decorations
I
up
don't
in
think
November.
I'm not bah humbug level.
No, I don't think you are.
I'm glad that other people agree with that.
Well, I've interacted with you over Christmas periods in the past, and you seem to be quite festive.
Yeah, I think I'm a naturally cheery, I think, which helps.
I joke, of course. Well, yes, and I think we can kind of see a little bit of a contrast with this today because I'm wearing festive clothing.
Yes.
And do you own festive clothing?
No.
Well, this is going to be an interesting point in itself, isn't it? Because my festive clothing is distinctly, quote unquote, secular.
Ooh.
Because for those who cannot see me, which is everyone, I'm currently wearing a Muppets Christmas t-shirt. And I like it very much. It makes me feel very festive. But of course, it's what people would definitely frame typically under the secular banner. But is it? That's going to be some of our conversation today. So as you may have guessed, lovely people, we are discussing Christmas today, which is a very interesting topic in and of itself when you're discussing the binaries of religion and secularization and so forth. But when you add popular culture to it, I think it adds an extra layer of complexity to this conversation because, of course, something we've done throughout this podcast is really try to break down those barriers between religion and popular culture. As Vivian would say, stretch definitions until they break. So that's something that you could do with Christmas anyway, let alone the popular culture element. So we're going to reflect on Christmas today. We're going to reflect on some Christmassy things that you find in popular culture and how it may relate to religion in interesting ways. So for you, Vivian, Christmas, is it a religious holiday? Is it a secular holiday? Is it both?
I find this interesting because growing up it was always it was a weird combination of both. So I think I've mentioned before that like in the very, very early Vivian days mm-hmm. I was raised in a Christian church because my dad is Christian. He, I think, is much more non-denominational. Right now he's Greek Orthodox. At the time he wasn't Greek Orthodox yet. I think we were going to an Episcopalian church for a while. I have been to many of them. I still don't know huge differences between them very well. And I even have a PhD in religious studies. So...
Yes, but something that's important to stress here is just because you have a PhD in religious studies, you don't know all the religions.
I don't know all religions.
I find this a lot when people say to me,
especially Christianity.
Aled, you must know about this form of Christianity. Must I?
I felt really bad. We went to an archery shoot for St. Nicholas shoot, which St. Nicholas is the saint of archery, as well as other things. I did not know this at the time, and the guy was like, oh, because St. Nicholas is the saint of what? And I was like, of course it's archery. I'm at an archery shoot. But instead I was like, I don't know, kids? I'm like, I have a PhD in religion. And I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
But anyway... when we were growing up, my dad was very, very deeply religious. I mean, I'm sure he still is. He just gave up on us after a while. And, but we used to go to the midnight masses. So it was a very, like, we went to church at this time for a really long time. It was a lot about Jesus. It was a lot about Christianity. It was a lot about that kind of front loading. My mother, however, She grew up Catholic, but is kind of in one of those things where she's very religious-y, but she doesn't really adhere to anything specific. And so she did not go to church with us when we would go, when they were still married. And she continued to not go to things. She would go with me to like Buddhist temples when I got a bit older and I became Buddhist. She started going with me to those because she's kind of Buddhist-y. But for her, Christmas was always much more on the secular side. But she would have still some religious elements here and there. So she had a nativity scene set up at the house. And it became a game between me and my sisters where every year we would hide the baby Jesus of the nativity scene because it was funny to have my mom walk around the house going, "Where's Jesus? I need to find Jesus." Which...
Don't we all?
for teenage girls found that incredibly funny, and so we just kept doing that. So yeah, it was always kind of a mixture of both, having kind of one parental unit being very religious with it and one parental unit not as much. I think I got to see both sides of it. And then moving here has been particularly interesting about that because in the UK, I find that tension much more present than it is even in the US, where...
okay.
Well, I mean, I think the tension's still there in the US, for sure.
Well, you're not allowed to say Merry Christmas in America now.
Well, the war on Christmas.
Yeah.
But I find here that tension... I think it's because people are trying to pretend that there's not the tension here. While in America, we still acknowledge that there's tension. While here, I think people pretend that there's not tension while they're like, well, I mean, it's not technically religious, while they're still doing very religious-y things.
Yeah.
Which I find, as a scholar, very interesting. So yeah, it's been... my own history with Christianity, or with Christmas, has been a very floaty in between the different boundaries, which I think has given me an interesting perspective.
Yeah, that is interesting, and we find a lot of these conversations play out in popular culture when so many, if especially if you talk about Christmas films.
Yes. So I wanted to mention, me and my husband, we decided we wanted to watch a funny, well, I guess I should say fun rather than funny, because they're very seldom laugh out loud funny, rom-com that's like Christmas themed. There's so many of them, especially on Netflix. We wanted to watch one on our Christmas, which we celebrated our Christmas like at the beginning of December. We don't often see the point in waiting when we have bought each other presents. So I had already bought his present. It had come in. It was wrapped. He had, like, earlier that day bought my present. He had wrapped it, and we just went, let's just swap them now. So we decided to have this very short, quick kind of couple Christmas together. And after opening presents, we decided to watch a holiday-themed rom-com. And we watched I think it's new this year, which is on Netflix, called Love Hard, which is a play off of Love Actually and Die Hard. Because those are the two kind of primary Christmas movies that it references a lot. And what I found interesting about... There's a lot of things interesting about this movie that I could pick apart. Not because it was particularly an amazing movie, but because there's a lot of really interesting things going on in this movie. But I'm going to leave the idea of catfishing to the side, because that's, I think, an entirely separate conversation than Christmas. And what I found particularly interesting regarding Christmas in this episode was this tension between Christmas as a religious holiday and Christmas as a secular holiday. And there was a lot of references to Christmas as a religious holiday, but it was always almost like a punchline to a joke. It was never the serious element of the movie. So if I were ever to get an ugly Christmas sweater, I would actually get this one. There was a point where the main character was wearing an ugly jumper that she got from the family of the potential significant other thing. And it said, "Happy Birthday, Jesus," really big on the jumper, which I thought was really funny. And then that's when I started realizing that basically all of the references to the Christian holiday were always in this kind of way. It was a really silly jumper that made you go, huh, that's a silly jumper. Or they had the grandma of the family always kind of had these outbursts of like, well, what about baby Jesus? That made you all go, ha ha. Like, it was that level. But the kind of quote unquote secular ideas of Christmas, of it being like this time for truth and love and family, were the things that were not the punchline.
Yeah.
Those were the important parts of the movie that were supposed to be the takeaways rather than this religious-y side, which was the punchline.
But of course, breaking that down is the morality that's at play of all these Christmas films.
Yeah.
It's still so religious.
Well, yes.
And we were discussing this before we started recording about how there's usually that cliche of goodwill to all men in a very heteronormative, androcentric way, and that idea that love prevails. And I mean, there are plenty of sad Christmas films out there, I'm sure. But there is definitely an archetype Christmas movie now, and I think some of that was established by It's a Wonderful Life, which is a very interesting film itself, because that's one of the quintessential Christmas movies now. It's not a religious Christmas movie, but it's got one of those feel-good vibes. Have you seen It's a Wonderful Life?
I think so. It's definitely been a long time if I have.
It's one of those staple Christmas movies that, in fact, my local cinema is showing it over the next few days. But it's very old, and it's a very old movie, and it comes back to the value that we all have, and that we can all contribute. And often Christmas in these sorts of films, they are presented as secular holidays, aren't they? So before we came on as well, I mentioned The Santa Claus, starring Tim Allen, in which Tim Allen is a corporate business guy who doesn't spend much time with his kid. When he does, the kid isn't that happy because he feels his dad doesn't pay much attention to him, so he's more interested in his stepdad, and he spends Christmas Eve with his Tim Allen dad, and his Tim Allen dad's a bit bar humbug, all I care about is making money type. And then that evening, Tim Allen accidentally kills Santa Claus, and is then punished by having to be Santa Claus for the rest of his life. And that's when then his heart begins to melt. He starts to bond with his son. He realizes the meaning of Christmas. But I also thought what was quite interesting about the Santa Claus film is that whole film is about faith and whether you believe in something. It's just that the conversation isn't necessarily about Jesus or God. It's about Santa. So the film begins with the young boy being told apparently he's been told on the schoolyard that Santa doesn't exist, and his stepdad, who's like a therapist or a psychologist, has sat him down and said, yeah, Santa doesn't exist, it's time to grow up now. But of course, when he and Tim Allen spend that night together where Tim Allen becomes Santa Claus, he then believes in Santa, and he's telling all the kids in school later that year that not only does Santa exist, but my dad is Santa. And there's this really... Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's quite an interesting film. Everyone should go and watch The Santa Claus
Everything
starring
in
Tim
popular
Allen.
culture can be massively interesting when you break it down.
Yeah, so he's telling all the kids in school that his dad is Santa, and he's telling his mother that her ex-husband is Santa. He's telling his stepdad that he's Santa, and people are starting to get worried about his mental well-being, and particularly his father's influence on him, because what's also happening at the same time is throughout this year, because he is now transitioning into being Santa, Tim Allen will wake up one morning and gained 5 stone in weight, and will has gone grey overnight, and there's one scene where he shaves and then his full white beard just grows back instantly, which everybody takes as this thing that he's doing to try and be close to his son, because he's finally close to his son. So he's pretending to be Santa, and he's essentially manipulating his child into thinking that he's Santa. So he ends up losing access to the child. And of course, there's this big sweeping finale where everybody finds out that he's Santa. What really bothers me about this film, though, is that it turns out that Santa does exist. That's the gist of this film, is that all the adults are Santa atheists and the kids are the believers, and it turns out that the kids are right, Santa does exist. So where did the Santa atheists think these presents come from? Because he takes presents to kids every Christmas, and all the parents are saying, oh yeah, well, Santa doesn't exist. Who's leaving? There's one scene where Tim Allen Santa leaves a surfboard. And no, not a surfboard, but it's a similar shape. But is it some sort of boat that you
like
do
a
some
kayak?
rafting? A kayak, that's it. I'm not a sporty physical person. He puts a massive kayak next to someone's Christmas tree. It's huge. And then the parents are just like, oh yeah, Santa doesn't exist. Who put the kayak in your living room, people?
Because I've had this thought a lot, because there's a lot of Christmas movies that are like, Santa actually exists, that I've thought about this. And I think it plays into that very heteronormative, weird idea of the family unit where like the parents don't talk to each other or don't like each other.
Yeah, probably.
Because
that's
then
what's
there would be
happening
that thing
here.
of like, oh, I guess my husband bought that. And you wouldn't, like, be like, hey, you didn't tell me that you were buying a kayak? That wouldn't be a conversation because, like, the old ball and chain,
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, because I know for a fact that if I put a kayak under our Christmas tree, Tori would come down in the morning and be like, what's with the kayak?
That's what I would say. If there was suddenly a kayak in the living room, my husband would have questions.
Yeah. So that's always perplexed me anyway, and I've got this whole thing, and I know other people have discussed this on the internet as well, but I've got this whole theory about how Tim Allen is being punished for the murder of Santa, because the only way, if you read the card, the Santa Claus, the titular Santa Claus, is that the only way you can escape being Santa is if you are killed. That's the only way you can stop being Santa. And then there's a moment at the end of the film where the stepdad says to the kid, oh, you'd be a great psychologist one day, or a great therapist, or I can't remember his profession. And then the kid looks up at Santa and goes, nah, I'm going to go into the family business. Does that mean he's going to kill his dad? I've got questions there as well. We could do a whole podcast about the Santa Claus. I've got theories about that film. Sometimes I think too much, clearly. But regardless, I found the whole faith conversation really interesting in that film. One of the reoccurring phrases in that film is seeing isn't believing, believing is seeing. And
yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting conversation around Santa Claus and faith and belief around that whole thing. Because there's, just even in just kind of general, the culture of it, of that there's this figure that we kind of allow children to believe in as kind of the phrasing, but really what you're doing is you're lying to them. But I don't think I would say that about Jesus. I want to be like, why are you lying to your kids about God? Like, that's something that is like, well, that's fine. But for some reason, Santa Claus, like, if I had kids, I would refuse to do the whole Santa Claus thing because I see it as lying to them.
I guess the difference here, though, is that parents who believe in God believe in God, whereas they don't believe in Santa.
But I find this interesting because as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking a lot about that word belief and what that means and what that breaks down to and how that is actualized, it is really fascinating how much we put stock into the word when it is something like God, but not stock into it when it's something like Santa. And it's because it is a very flexible word. And I've talked about this before. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But it is a very flexible word. It is a very flexible idea, but we don't act like it is when it is pertaining to other things. And so I think Santa is a really fascinating case study of the flexibility of the word belief.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to mention this here just because it's just occurred to me and it always cracks me up. Do you remember when Trump was taking phone calls from kids on a Santa hotline on Christmas Eve a few years ago?
No.
So the kids, there was some sort of Santa hotline that kids could phone up and find where Santa is throughout the night. And Trump was taking some of these calls, and he was speaking to a 7-year-old child and said something along the lines of, "So are you still a believer in Santa?" Because at 7, it's marginal, right? And it always just cracks me up because, firstly, clearly, yes, they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't be calling the Santa
Well,
hotline.
but also, like, even if they don't and they just think this is a bit of a fun
Yeah,
thing
but
to
also what I find
do.
really interesting about that is that Trump is such a religious president, and I
They,
and what I found there was that the idea of belief, it's what you were saying about the flexibility of belief, that the
yeah.
belief in Santa there was, or well, believing in something there was absurd. It's quite
Maybe
interesting.
next year I will see whether or not I can get on an old friend slash teacher of mine on the podcast. He's a bit of a luddite and really hates new technology. When he was writing my letter of recommendation to grad school, he insisted on writing it by hand and mailing it as opposed to
Oh
filling
wow.
in the electronic form.
Okay, that's very old school.
So I don't know whether I could get him on the podcast. I will try. But he wrote a book on the history of Santa Claus. And I
Oh wow.
think that
Okay.
would be a really fascinating episode, like in a year when we're back to doing Christmas. But there's the kind of connection between Saint Nick and Santa Claus that they are seen as the same
Mm.
figure. It's just a different name. But that's not
Hmm.
always how it was. And that for a
Hmm.
while, Santa Claus was the secular figure, quote unquote. I mean, not always, but will ignoring some elements of it, he wasn't always connected to Saint Nick, but he became connected to Saint Nick over time, and I find that
Hmm.
fascinating because he's always seen as like the secular figure,
Yeah.
but has been inherently connected to a Christian saint,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
and
Yeah. So it still has that link to it
so
being a.
even Santa has the tension between the religious holiday and the
Mm.
secular holiday.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, he does. And as a figure, he is that. Would you say Santa could be classed as a monster?
Well, yes, but again, this is getting into some of the history of it.
Yeah.
A little bit of, I guess, a pre promo. But a couple of days after Christmas, I've got a blog post coming out on Krampus where I talk a little bit about it. But Christmas and monsters are, I think, a whole nother avenue of conversation. So I will try not to spend too much time on this. But I will spend a little bit of time on this by saying that I do think that Christmas and horror are more intricately linked than a lot of people give credit to.
Mm.
And the Christmas Carol, I think, is the perfect example of the way that Christmas horror presents itself.
Well, it's a ghost story.
It's a ghost, paranormal, mystical, creepy ass story. Like it is.
Mm.
I don't know how many people listening to this would have read the original Christmas Carol story by Charles Dickens, but it is creepy. And
Yeah.
it's like it would be a scary story to read a kid.
Yeah, it's very and some of the language in it is very dark as well,
Mm,
and just the way some things are described.
yeah.
Um, let's talk about Christmas Carol. Do you like Christmas Carol?
Yeah. I mean, I think of the Christmas stories, it's the one that I probably recognize the most. But I think there also is that element of, I think it's a much bigger deal here in the UK than it is in probably
Yes.
other areas of the world, which
Well, we
is an interesting element of culture to talk about anyway. But
yes, well, we briefly touched on this in our other podcast. What's interesting about when we were discussing the Muppets
yes.
and when the Muppet Christmas Carol came up, that in the UK, Christmas Carol is very much an institution.
Yes.
Everyone's got their own favorite Scrooge. It's like having a favorite James Bond or a favorite Doctor Who. and there's so many different adaptations as well. And so often when I hear it discussed in British discourse, especially in you probably gathered this from our previous podcasts, but I read the Guardian a lot, and whenever Christmas Carol gets discussed in the Guardian, they talk about it as being the secular Christmas story. I think I even read once, this isn't in the Guardian, but somewhere I read that schools should replace the Nativity with Christmas Carol because it sums up modern values. It's so it's not a dogmatic religious story. This isn't me saying this.
Yeah,
This is
no.
me. This is me.
Sorry, I was making a face, listeners, and Alan could
Yeah,
see
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. This is me just paraphrasing what I read in this article about how it sums up modern values. It doesn't rely on belief. It's still. I know. Okay, cool. What was I saying?
Christmas Carol and it being a secular.
Yes. So the interesting thing here, little segue. But we've just had an intermission, haven't we?
Yeah, well, I mean,
We've
they
just-
won't know.
Yeah, but doopy doopy doo doopy doo.
Hopefully, I'll actually edit it out.
Yeah. So, just so you all know, everyone, Sackboy has arrived. Anyway, yes, it was this really interesting conversation about how it should be performed at schools by kids. Because the nativity is another really interesting phenomenon about Christmas, I think.
Yes.
And what's it like in the States? Do you have nativities in the same
Not
way? That,
at schools.
not at well, yeah.
I found that really weird when I came here. It just
Yeah. I was
So for any non-UK listeners, which we have quite a few of, surprisingly, because of how much we talk about UK culture, I am surprised by how many we have outside of the UK. But the nativity, like if you watch Love Actually and the emphasis on that nativity play, it is not that outside of how things actually are. Every kid seems to get a role, no matter how weird or outside of the nativity it actually is, just like the octopus in Love Actually. And like normal, like state-funded schools will do a nativity play. It's not just for religious schools or private schools or anything like that.
Well, that's why I was asking you, because I knew you wouldn't have it in schools, but I was wondering if nativities were a thing outside of schools.
I remember
where kids would enact the story.
I think the only time I remember us doing one, and I only remember because there's photos, because famously have a bad memory. But my preschool put one on, but it was a Christian preschool. So again, it was a specifically Christian. It was run by a church, so the nativity made sense there. But I think mostly it's just in decoration. So like how my mom would have the nativity set.
Yeah.
You would sometimes see like Christmas, whenever people do like the big Christmas lights in their front lawns, there would be a nativity set sometimes. But you don't get kids performing the nativity play unless it's through some kind of church organization.
Yeah. So yeah, in the UK, the word nativity is closely associated with children performing the nativity scene.
Yeah.
And yours truly, was head shepherd.
Ooh.
Or leading shepherd or something like that. So what set me apart from all the other lowly shepherds was that I had a enormous cane. And I can't remember what it's called. The canes that shepherds use with the hook, like.
Isn't it just like a shepherding crook?
Yeah. So I was head chef. Head chef? I was head shepherd. Okay, you can tell how much MasterChef I've been watching of late. I was head shepherd, and I really enjoyed that. But my mum was, for many years, a playgroup leader, and she would have to write each year's nativity and assign roles to kids and things like that. And it was very stressful things because she really enjoyed doing it, but it means a lot to parents. This is how, for non-UK listeners, it's a very important part. It's almost a rite of passage for children to star in the nativity.
Yeah, I mean, I would have people telling me, like how Alan just did, they know what role they had in the nativity. Anybody who had like a main role is definitely going to bring it up at some point in conversation with them.
I mean, look how I shoehorned head shepherd.
Yeah,
Not
like
exactly
if
Joseph, is
someone
it?
had like a Joseph or a Mary role, like that is, you're going to know that about those people.
It was always the tallest boy that got Joseph, in my experience.
I remember my supervisor for my PhD was talking about his daughter was getting ready to put one on. I'm sorry, I do not remember what the daughter played because I did not care. But he was kind of saying, he was like, oh yeah, you know, because I played whatever. He played a shepherd or whatever it was. And then asked me, oh, you know, what role did you play? And I'm like, I didn't do it. But it was like this sudden breakdown of, he was like, I don't know how to continue a conversation then about the nativity if you don't
Yeah.
continue with the, this is what I have done.
It's a very strange thing, isn't it? And I think Dara O'Brien once did a stand-up joke about how it should be replaced with Die Hard, and he wanted to see kids act that out every year. And we'll get to Die Hard in a moment because I want to discuss that as well, especially since you mentioned there was that show based on it. So yeah, Christmas Carol though is really interesting in terms of the way it presents morality, and as you were saying, it is a ghost story. It has those elements of paranormal, mystical elements. There's clearly an afterlife
Yeah.
in Christmas Carol. What sort of afterlife that is, we don't know. It's never is it, well. It's been
I mean,
a
it's
while since I've
ghosty.
read the. It's been a while since I've read the text, but I don't think it's ever defined as being Christian by Dickens.
No, but I mean, in the same way that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more as we get into the idea of morality as being somehow not religious, but you know, when you're in a, say, Christian based society like the UK, like the US, a lot of the even quote unquote secular ideas of things like afterlife or whatever are going to be inherently based on Christian understandings.
Yeah,
So, for example, the fact that there are ghosts instead of reincarnations, you're already in one particular
yeah,
ideology.
yeah. Very much so. Very much so. There's one adaptation of Christmas Carol that I really enjoy. It's called Scrooge. It stars Albert Finney as Scrooge, and it's a musical, which is probably why I like it because I really like musicals. Surprise, surprise. And but there's a really weird sequence where everything's pretty much going as it does in the original Dickens story, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows him his grave. He realizes, life's coming to an end, and then what happens here, and I think this happens in a couple of other adaptations, is he falls into the grave, and then he wakes up on Christmas morning, and he's a renewed
Yeah.
man, and so on. But in this version, he falls into the grave, and he literally falls into hell. Literally falls into hell. He wakes up in hell. Everything's on fire. Everything's red, and Jacob Marley is just waiting for him. And now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm really starting to appreciate how bizarre this sequence is. They take him into another room, and in that room, it's his office, but it's all frosty and cold. It's like the opposite of hell. Incredibly cold, ice over everything, and there's rats everywhere. And then these incredibly butch men come in with his chain, because he's made his own chain the same way that Jacob Marley made a chain. And this chain is huge because he's lived longer than Jacob Marley. And the men come in and they're all greased up for some inexplicable reason. I'm not making this up. But they're all shirtless and greased up. And they put this chain around him, and then he's just got to work in hell in this really cold office for eternity. And then he wakes up. And that fascinated me no end, even as a child. Because I thought, oh, okay. I guess I was a really interesting child because I was thinking about it back then, but I was thinking, oh, okay, they are Christians.
Mm.
Oh, this is a Christian story because they're in hell. Now, obviously, simplistic understanding again. Forgive me, I was like 12, but I thought that was really interesting. And of course, there's the process of redemption as well. Maybe we should have Chris DC on to talk about this. But Scrooge goes through that redemptive arc that is now just. I mean, it's almost a cliche now, isn't it, in
Well,
storytelling?
yeah.
But I think it's one of those fascinating Christmas stories that, despite it being propped up as the secular British Christmas story, it straddles those boundaries
Mm.
no end. And what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I always find it interesting when anything is described as secular when it has
Ghosts in it.
ghosts and paranormal things. Because even just the idea of the paranormal is a basic understanding of what's normal versus not, which is inherently based on your ideas of what functions in the world and what doesn't, which is somewhat religious. Um, not to get too in the weeds about it. But yeah, I guess I've always thought of the Christmas Carol as, I think it to me it was so quintessentially British.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that holds even when you're talking about this decision of whether or not it is a secular or a religious version of Christmas. Because I think that the way it struggles that line is just like how Britain does it.
Yeah,
That
yeah, it
it
does.
really does kind of, in this sense of like, oh, I mean, it has all of these elements to it, but it's not religious, we're not gonna we're not gonna say it's religious, but it
Mm.
definitely is, but in this kind of weird subtle way. And in a way, I think the UK has always been much more entrenched in Christianity. The US is a lot more overtly entrenched, but I think
Mm.
the UK has that thing of it pretending that it's not entrenched while it is, which can almost be sometimes more problematic because then people don't recognize when there is ostracization. That, I don't know if I said that word right. When there is like
Mm.
marginalization, when there is issues
Yeah.
of that kind of thing of like, well, no, this is Christianity, what you're talking about, not just British culture.
Yes, and I think what's really interesting about the Nativity is that it's that one aspect of the British Christmas that is so outspokenly religious.
Mm.
In that, generally speaking, and I appreciate this is generally speaking, but generally speaking, parents love the Nativity.
Yeah.
It does very well. There isn't particularly a backlash against the idea of the Nativity in a way that, say, state mandated weekly worship. State mandated weekly worship in the UK is a hugely contested topic. So, for non UK listeners, children in UK schools from very young age all the way up to 16, when you're in sixth form in the UK, so between 16 and 18, you do have the independence to be able to withdraw. But they will take part in weekly collective worship that will involve usually a prayer and the singing of a hymn. So in my school, it was a hymn, and Parents can withdraw their their children from weekly worship, which is absolutely right. But there's a lot of backlash to it in a way that you do not see with the Nativity. The Nativity is generally regarded as quite a beloved Christmas tradition now in the UK, and I don't know if it's because it's that tradition aspect as well.
Yeah,
And of course, the children are so young in a nativity. That's the other thing that's important to stress to the listeners here. You don't find 14, 15 year olds doing the nativity. It's, 3, 4 year olds. They're very young as well. So there's also the element of, oh, look how cute it is. I appreciate I've gone on a bit of a tangent here because I've got a rant about state mandated worship as well, because I think it's absolutely right that parents should be able to take their children out of state mandated worship if they wanted to. But what I do not agree with is that they can also do that with religious education. It's the one subject in the UK curriculum that a parent can withdraw their child from at any time and have every right to do that. And that, to me, makes it look like it is a religious indoctrination subject, which it isn't. Well, at least it
I
shouldn't
was about
be.
to say, I think that's more of an issue with the curriculum than
Indeed, that too.
because there was a time after my PhD where I thought about, I could teach, RE at like a sixth form or something, because I can't deal with little kids, so it would have to be at least 16. And so I looked into it, and I was looking at the curriculum, and I was just like, this isn't religious studies.
No, it's not. And that is a tangent that we should explore on this podcast at some point. Yes, so state mandated worship is hugely contested and debated and so on, but the nativity not so much. It is generally quite highly regarded in the UK. So you don't have that atheist pushback either, for example. And I have no doubt they're out there. I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who do object to the nativity, and absolutely fine.
It's just not as commonly found, I think.
No, not at all. Generally speaking, parents are quite excited to have their kids in a nativity.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation now as well, because schools have different policies now on whether parents can film nativities. Because, of course, you're capturing footage of children. So there are videos in my parents' house of my nativity and my brother's nativity, when we performed in it and things. But now, so there's politics about that as well, because people want to take the photos of their kids.
I mean, this is starting to get off track, but I don't know how much of that has to do with the bigger presence of the online sphere now than there was, say, when you were, because you're old, when you were a kid.
Oh, yeah. Well, mine, for the record, mine are on VHS.
Yeah, because, it's... And, I mean, this is kind of... I just kind of more want to mention it in order to be able to say we'll put a pin in that, because I do think would be really interesting to talk about at some point. But I do know that there are people, or there's been kids who have taken their parents to court over the fact that they have been... essentially their images and their names and all of their information has been present online without their consent, because the parents have just been posting on Facebook or on forums or on mommy blogs about their kids without checking or getting permission, because they were children, but now that they're a little bit older, they go, hey, all of my personal information is easily found online now. And there's actually been starting to make laws and stuff as kids start to take their parents to court over it. So it is a very kind of contentious thing. So,
everyone, if you see a friend of yours saying, look at my kid dressed up as head shepherd, give them a warning.
Yeah, ask permission before you post your family's information all over the internet.
Yes, I agree. Again, another topic for another time.
For another time. But what I wanted to do a quick mention of, is the other really big pseudo-secular conversation in, I know we're getting close to time, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned it.
No, go ahead.
Was the Christmas song. And again, this is huge in the UK, but it is still big in the US. It's not like it doesn't exist there, but it is massive. And again, it is often presented as secular Christmas music. The Mariah Carey, All I Want for Christmas Is You type of Christmas song. But I wanted
everyone's got a favourite.
There's another one. I don't know. Are you aware of the NSYNC Christmas album?
No, mercifully.
This is another one that is played a lot in particularly shops and coffee shops and things like that around Christmas time, alongside the Mariah Carey. I mean, Mariah Carey is untouchable as far as the height of which that Christmas song has achieved. But there's this other Christmas song by NSYNC called Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. And I'm sure if you heard a little bit of it, you would probably recognize it. You might just not recognize that it's NSYNC. But I wanted to read some of the lyrics from the chorus. Again, secular Christmas song made by NSYNC. And with the blessings from above, God sends you his love and everybody's okay. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays.
Yeah.
And in the Mariah Carey one, there's mentions of church bells ringing as signaling that it's Christmas.
Yes.
It's in one of the very first verses. The church bells in town are ringing in song full of happy sounds. Baby, please come home. So again, even in these kind of pop music played on the radio, Christmas songs, there's still this slight tension.
Like in, have you heard Cliff Richard's Mistletoe and Wine?
Maybe?
You probably recognise. Yeah. You've lived in the UK long enough that you will have heard it. I was about to say,
I've heard a lot of Christmas songs.
And now I appreciate Cliff Richard is well known for being Christian. But this was still released as a secular pop song, and the lyric there is Christmas time, mistletoe and wine, children singing Christian rhyme. But the secular Christmas song in the UK is a very interesting thing in general, because there's almost a bar humbug thing going on with them, because they get played so early, and it's usually the same songs every year as well. It takes a lot now to make a Christmas song that becomes one of the classics.
Yeah.
Because so much of it is tied with nostalgia. See our episode about nostalgia.
Which we talked about Christmas quite a lot in that episode.
Yes, because of course the Christmas songs that people love are the ones they can remember from a young age. And in the UK, there was even a national, still is, but it's been hijacked by corporate entities, really. The Christmas number one in the UK was an enormous deal from the 70s to the early 2000s. Who was the number one selling song at Christmas? And you've got classic battles as well. So Slade's Merry Christmas Everybody and Wizard's I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day were both released the same week. And they were number one and number two. Slade were number one, Wizard were number two. And those are two of the most famous ones. So there was a big conversation, a big buzz around who gets the Christmas number one. And then, Simon Cowell, the evil overlord, has hijacked it over the years with setting up X Factor winners to get them and whatnot. But that aside, Christmas songs in the UK, and you could provide us with the American alternative to this. Do you find that people have a favourite Christmas song that they will often argue about? Because of late, Richard Osman from Pointless has been doing like a Christmas song World Cup on Twitter, where he sets up daily polls, and they become really popular. Like, he gets funny. Tens of thousands of votes, and people are really passionate about which Christmas song is their favourite. Do you find that's the case in the States? Or does Mariah Carey hold all the chips?
Yes and no. I think it in not quite the same way. I don't think a lot of the newer ones get brought into the conversation in the same way that it happens in the UK. Because again, I think the UK Christmas song it's another weird cultural touchstone that happens here that doesn't quite happen there, but we'll get some of the new ones. Like the NSYNC one was really big for a while, and obviously Mariah Carey's album, I think she still makes like $5 million a year on the royalties of
I've got no doubt.
Like
yeah, I heard that Noddy Holder has a holiday in Barbados every year.
Yeah.
From the royalties he made last Christmas. I think
Mariah Carey can just live her entire life off of just that song, not including all of her other huge songs.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, so obviously there are certain ones that have reached the high point, but I think from my memory of Christmas music in the US is you would occasionally get like a Mariah Carey pop on. or you would get like versions of old songs by new artists, but it was mostly the old kind of more traditional Christmas songs that you would hear constantly. While here, you get those old songs, don't get me wrong. They're definitely around and you definitely hear them, but they're a lot more interspersed with random pop song about Christmas.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, as a nice way to round this off, the quote-unquote secular pop Christmas song, which is your favourite, Vivian?
So, I'm not big on Christmas music. I know this is part of my slight bah humbugness.
Yes, I was going to say, you're bringing down my buzz here.
I'm not a huge, well, I'm getting there. I'm not a huge fan of Christmas music, more generally speaking. So any of the songs that are like covers of contemporary or of the old songs, I tend to not like.
Yeah.
Because the traditional things, A, are either very Christian, or B, are annoying. Like Jingle Bells or Santa Claus is Coming to Town. It's like, I don't need to hear it. But I don't want to be too basic about it, but I think that one of my favorites is Mariah Carey's, purely because of the fact that it has the staying power already. Like, it's been proven for that staying power because of how big it is. And if you removed all of the Christmas elements from it, it's still just a really good pop song. Where I don't think that's the case for every...
Oh, no, not at all.
Every, Christmas pop song. So I would say Mariah Carey. As the basic person that I am.
Yeah. I was wondering if you were going to pick Fairy Tale of New York. Am I being too British here?
Maybe.
You're aware of the song?
I'm sure. It doesn't...
Oh, okay, I'll send you a link to it later.
Again,
it's a very popular one because it's quite miserable.
I hear... Oh, see, I feel like it's one of those things where, like... I don't know if I'd want a miserable one. Like, you gotta have a song that, like, makes you happy.
Yeah, well, it's got a lovely chorus, but it's by the Pogues, and they sing it with Kirsty MacColl, and it's a duet between the guy from the Pogues, whose name I can't remember, and Kirsty MacColl, and there's a story that he takes her to New York at Christmas time. He's going to make her a star and things like that. And then it has that really famous... I'll send you the link. I'm sure you will know it when you see it. I was wondering if that was going to be one that you would like.
I think that's all, because, like... Because the thing with the Mariah Carey song is that it's not exactly... Like, the subject matter doesn't sound happy, but it's an upbeat, happy-ish song. And, you can put it on and be like, yeah...
Yeah.
If you didn't listen to the lyrics,
I
you're
don't,
like, cool.
I don't object to Mariah Carey's.
I think that's my point is I think you need kind of a happy, upbeat sounding song to be ranked on my favorite Christmas list. Because it's like, I'm already not going to be super in the mood, so you gotta have a song that's going to put me in the mood rather than keeping the mood going, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I need the jump start, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What is your favorite song? Your Christmas song?
There can be only one. It is Christmas Time, Don't Let the Bells End by The Darkness. Have you heard this?
No, The Darkness is much bigger here than it is in the US. In the US, they're a one-hit wonder.
Okay, I will send you this after this recording. It is my favourite Christmas song of all time. And it contains my favourite Christmas lyric of all time as well, which is, dust underneath the mistletoe leaf, and you're not here. You went away upon Boxing Day. Now how the hell am I going to make it into the new year? Just makes me smile every time I hear it. It's a brilliant song. And that's another song that if you took out all the Christmas elements, it's still a kick-ass song.
Yeah.
With like a big Queen-style guitar solo. And it was robbed of Christmas number one, where when Gary Jules' cover of Mad World got to number one. And it was the last time that I listened to the charts be announced live. And I was so annoyed and cross that 13, 14-year-old Aled turned the radio off in disgust. And from that moment on, I knew that the charts were for posers. Uh, again, showing how important the Christmas number one is in the UK, because I was so invested in The Darkness getting Christmas number one. It's a great Christmas song. I'm partial to Slater, so I'm very much a Brit who loves his Christmas songs, I will say. I do find Fairy Tale of New York to be a bit too depressing for my liking.
Yeah.
And there are, like, Weezer have got a Christmas EP that I enjoy listening to, but it's not one of the ones that gets played on the radio. And recently, William Shatner released a Christmas album called Shatner Claus. And I really enjoy that as well. William Shatner doing things like Run, Rudolph, Run, and Jingle Bells, and so on. I have no doubt you would hate it, Vivian. In fact, I have no doubt most people would hate it. There's just a very slim portion of people that loves that sort of thing that William Shatner does. And I am one. I am one of that slim, slender portion of people that enjoys when it. Yeah. So, listeners, if you haven't heard "Christmas Time," "Don't Let the Bells End" by The Darkness, it is fantastic. I listen to it every year, and we normally go and see The Darkness every Christmas time because they tend to tour in November, December.
Not this year.
Well, they did tour this year, but we didn't go because
fair
the plague.
enough.
It sounds like they did it really well, the COVID passports at the door and stuff, but we still didn't feel we were ready. And they'll usually perform that, and there's like snow, foam snow being sprayed into the crowd and stuff during the final chorus of, and that's when we know that Christmas is truly arriving, when we see them play that song live. It's great.
Well, this episode is supposed to be coming out Christmas Eve, so the eve before Christmas Eve. So hopefully this will give you some songs and ideas to listen to going in, and hopefully you won't dissect too much of your Christmas time in the religious versus secular as you go about your Christmas.
Yes, try to enjoy it as much as you can. Hopefully we haven't ruined it by making you question.
Maybe in a couple of years you'll start to have it ruined for you by us, but we'll give you that time to slowly sink into the despair of over-analyzing your life.
Yes. Oh, but that was really fun. I am feeling, despite the breaking down of what Christmas is, I am still feeling quite Christmassy. Are you?
I'm glad. I am looking forward to it. On Thursday when this comes out, I will be doing lots of Christmas baking, so that way I will be, because I like to bring gifts of food to the people that we are coming to visit. So I have quite a bit of baking to do in preparation for that.
Good.
So, and that always puts me in a good mood. That's my favorite part. My favorite part of any holiday, as you could probably have guessed from the food episode, is the food. And
it's all about the food.
That's the best part of it. So I always look forward to it.
I found that as I grew up, there's that threshold moment, isn't there, where Christmas just becomes about the food.
Yes.
And I think once you hit that moment, there's no going back. Now it is just all about the food.
So I'm looking forward to it. I hope that our listeners, if you do celebrate Christmas, will have a lovely Christmas. If you do not celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a lovely time.
Yes. Treat yourself
and I
anyway.
hope
Why
you
not?
have delicious food no matter what you are eating and
No
what
matter
the
what
purpose
we're
is for.
Absolutely, yes. Happy midwinter.
Yeah. Happy
or
solstice.
mid-year if you find yourself in Australia. I don't know if we have any listeners in Australia, but
I think we do. I would have to look at our analytics again. Let us know if you...
Yeah, let us know. Get in touch. Let us know what your favourite Christmas song is. I want to know.
And
I love talking about pop music.
And Alan, if people want to talk to you about Christmas music or to wish you a lovely Christmas, where can they go?
Come and find me on Twitter, folks, at LJLL Thomas. And Vivian, where can they wish you a Merry Christmas?
They can do that on Twitter or Instagram at Vivian Asimos. And you can also check out the website incidentalmythology.com, which is, by the way, where this podcast is. Yes,
and there will be, from what you were saying, a Christmassy post soon.
Yeah, well, there'll be two Christmassy posts. There's, I already posted up one that is the history of the Yule Lads, which is an Icelandic, creatures? that turned into normal men at some point in its history. So you can go and find out about that, what they are and how they developed over there. And on the 28th or something like that is when Krampus will drop. So hopefully you'll enjoy that.
Good, good. And until then, folks.
Bye.
Bye.